My husband and I really love to go driving. We prefer road trips, but on the weekends or nights, whenever we have nothing better to do, we usually just go cruising and just drive around. We prefer smooth and not busy roads. On this particular night, we were really bored and decided to go cruising. We went up north to a small town about a half an hour from the city where the roads are really curvy and smooth. This town is pretty close to the mountains, and if you follow this particular main street all the way up north, it starts driving up to a mountain. It's about 9 p.m. and there are very few cars in the road already since it's a small, nice little cute town. But we keep going north away from all of the houses and stores, and eventually where the roads start curving uphill. We drive for about 15 minutes more and it's pitch black when we see some blinking lights. As we get closer, we see that there's a truck on the side of the road facing us. I'm getting the chills thinking about being all the way out here in the middle of nowhere and there's a stranded truck on the side of the road. As he slowly approaches closer, I tell my husband that it's probably for the best to just turn back and that I had a really bad feeling. But at this point, we're pretty much right next to the truck. As he pulls up next to the truck, a young blonde guy, maybe in his late 20s, comes around and gets next to our window. I get such a bad vibe by this, and I tell my husband not to put the window down. I think that he also gets a weird feeling, so he actually listens to me. He kinda just loudly asks what's wrong, and the guy says something along the lines of something's wrong with his truck and that he might need a hand with it. His phone is also dead. My husband asks what happened, but the guy just insists on showing him and to come take a look. He says it very friendly, and he even calls him bro, and he says that he's really glad we pulled up. My husband tells him, "You know what, man, I really won't be much help. I don't really know anything about cars, but let me call someone to see if they can help you with this." The guy is insisting, and he gets visibly upset. I'm looking back at the truck, and I thought that I caught some movement inside of the truck. I tell my husband that I really think we need to go. Like, now. He probably saw the look of fear that was all over my face because he then put the car in reverse, but as he did that, the guy is now right behind our car. He's acting really stressed out and rubbing his face and kind of pacing. So my husband decides to go forward instead. We drive up for maybe about 2 minutes, trying to find a place to turn around since the road is so narrow. The road turns to a dirt road and there's a little more space on the side, so he's able to turn the car around. I'm absolutely dreading going back that way now, and our phones have no signal at all. In my mind, I know that this could all really be someone with car problems. Maybe there's a friend in the truck too. He never said he was alone, but I just can't help the really bad feeling that was in my gut. We soon reach the area where the truck had been, but there's no truck at all. We then drive down maybe another 5 minutes, but no trace of the truck, and we're absolutely sure that we passed the place where it would have been. Like I said, we didn't drive up too far to begin with. I'm both relieved and absolutely terrified that the truck was no longer there. If it really had broken down, how did they get it to work again in such a short time? Calming myself down, I'm telling my husband, hey, maybe they really did get it to work. Maybe it turned on all of a sudden and they were able to drive off. It's suspicious, but not impossible. As we keep driving though and the roads are straightening out, we notice far off the truck with all of the lights off and it's parked to the side again, and we notice some movement in the bed of the truck. I say out loud, "Why did they turn off all the lights?" I think that we're still way too far away to see them, but we see two figures get on the other side of the truck and then crouch down as if they're trying to hide. We get closer and my husband floors it. As we drive past, the two men get up. One of them the guy we had spoken to, and the other someone else, with a very surprised look on both of their faces. One of them runs behind us for a bit and we see them getting tinier in the back. I keep looking back, absolutely terrified, but it's dark back there now, when all of a sudden I then see the headlights turn on in the truck. They then start driving in our direction and very fast. My husband keeps going fast and eventually we finally lose the headlights. I keep looking back the rest of the way, so scared that they're somehow still following us. Maybe they turned off their lights again and we just can't see them. Anyway, After driving for a very long time back to the city, we try to convince ourselves that no one's following us. We decide to call the non-emergency line and give them a description of what we saw. No, we didn't get the plates of the truck. It was all so fast, and in all of the fear, I just really didn't think to get them. We give a description of the guy we saw and the type of truck it was, but there was really nothing else that could really be done. Now, I realized that all of this could probably be rationalized, but in the moment, we were absolutely filled with terror. I mean, being out there in the middle of nowhere and all the possibilities. They could have been armed. They could have put their truck sideways on the road and left us with nowhere to go. They could have put something out in the road to rip up our tires. And even though it could all have some sort of explanation, there's still so many questions. Why couldn't he tell us what was wrong? How did the truck work again so fast? Why did they turn off all of their lights, and why did they hide? It's been about a year, and it's just a creepy experience now. We still go cruising, but we usually just stick to a little more civilized areas now. That is, at least for nighttime cruises. I used to ride a motorcycle as a sole method of transportation when I was studying, and I used to work on hotel cocktail bars during the summer holidays. About 6 years ago, I was working at a historic, stereotypically grand hotel in a very rural area of the UK. I worked a long afternoon and evening into the night. I finished cleaning up the bar around 2 a.m. and walked through the underbelly of the hotel to retrieve my motorcycle and make the journey home. I can still clearly remember the feeling of the crisp night air and the absolute pitch-black silence of the countryside after the hot and seemingly never-ending nights of serving drinks to all of the dinner-goers and party-goers. It was always sort of intensely relaxing, now that being adult meant not being scared of the dark or being outside on a motorcycle in the middle of nearly nowhere at 2 a.m. Riding through the local town took me a few minutes before I left to follow the dark country roads home. At this point in the story, I was riding a Honda 125cc, around 11 horsepower. Pretty basic and old but clean, and it did the job, regardless of its quirks, such as the dim headlight which would dim and flicker even more when coming to a stop. I was riding along these pitch-black roads with fields and woods surrounding me, and I was very much alone for about 20 minutes. Then out of nowhere, I saw a brief blast of bright blue headlights in my mirrors coming right behind me. Moments later, there were dazzling headlights that had arrived right behind me in seconds. Almost immediately, a large Range Rover then pulls out to overtake me, blasting past, barely inches away from me. I decide to respond with a really long blast on my horn. Big mistake. The Range Rover pulls out in front of me and then slams on the anchors in what seemed like an attempt to have me lose control under sudden braking, or that they were trying to get me to rear-end the range. Bikes can, even when they're old and rely on drum brakes, stop pretty quickly, so I didn't end up rear-ending the maniac in front. I came to a controlled stop. I see the door of the Range then crack open, and then a figure begin to step out. I went for it, using all 11 horsepower of the little Honda's power, pulling an overtake. However, in those moments, this angered, crazed maniac had shut his door and then stepped on the accelerator, causing us to be completely level and accelerating together when I reached his car. He then started to run me off the road, pulling to the right and wedging me further over toward the ditch at the side of the road. This is where I ended up and struggling to control the bike on the wet, dew-heavy grass around the side of the road, trying to stop the 140-kilogram motorcycle from dropping into the ditch. I struggled to regain balance but managed to pull the bike back onto the road. At this point, I noticed that the guy had gotten out of the Range Rover and walked around to the back, opened it, and he was reaching inside for something. I had turned the bike to face the other side of the road, ready to turn either way and try to make an escape from the escalating situation. Just as I looked to turn, I took one more look over at him, to then see him pulling a large long object out of the back of the Range. I just went for it, taking another glance over my shoulder after about 200 meters to see that he'd begun to continue driving up the road away from where I'd run off at. I then slowed down to see what he'd do next after driving away from me. He reached the top of the road and pulled over to the left, waiting for me, the lights now reflecting on the road. It was absolutely eerie. My heart was beating so fast, yet it felt like time had stopped. I decided to just carry on in the opposite direction, trying to find an alternative route home in the pitch black. Right before doing this, I decided to check my phone for a signal, and I had no mobile coverage at all. Yeah, that was definitely one of the scariest nights I'd ever experienced. Back in September, I was taking hunter ed classes with my dad. Basically, you learn parts of a gun, how to handle it safely, etc. Since it was in person and not the online classes, the instructors had a lot of stories to tell. These were mostly about people not handling guns correctly, drunk shooting, etc. Most of them didn't end well. We were going shooting a lot those 2 weeks to prepare for the test at the end. One time we went to an abandoned town that a lot of people shot at. It had been shut down due to high lead levels. I had butterflies the whole ride there, but just brushed it off as nerves. Mistake number 1. During that evening, we were the only ones there. We thought that it would be pretty nice since there'd be more spots open. Keyword thought. We settled on a spot that was behind a hill and shot at another hill that was nearby. My dad was sighting the .22 gun that we had brought in. I was sitting behind him. I had my earplugs in, so it was really hard to hear things, especially far away. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was a very loud shot. It had to have been my dad since I was so close to him and it was so loud. I was initially pretty scared, as the above-mentioned stories we were told of shots being accidentally fired didn't really end that well. In a concerned voice, I asked if it was my dad. When he told me no, my fear became so much greater. Another shot was fired and our only thought was try to become seen. We quickly unloaded the gun so that it was safe and then ran up the hill. Mistake number 2. My mom was wearing bright yellow and we were all jumping up and down, waving our arms. There was absolutely no way that we couldn't be seen. After 2 or 3 more shots, we ran to the edge. It was kind of like a valley or a dried out lake. The edges were pretty high. We were at the bottom and the shooter was at the top. The next part confirmed our belief that he had seen us and still continued to shoot anyways. My dad decided to call the police to report what was happening. He decided to walk further out to see the details, like the color of the truck, how many people were there, etc. And then he was in full view of the shooter. Just a little bit after my dad got on the phone, the guy left, probably assuming the cops or other authorities were called. We're not too sure, but we're pretty convinced that he was shooting at us. We stayed where we were for a really long time, waiting for the police, when a group of maybe about 4 high schoolers showed up. My dad went and warned them about the previous events, and we decided after about 15 minutes of waiting and no police arriving that we wanted to get out of there ASAP. We went and gathered all of our things and then looked at where all the shots had went. The shots were no more than 25 meters away. As we were driving away, the police finally came. They asked us some questions and we were finally able to get the crap out of there. Whoever it was unfortunately never caught, and fortunately we never went back there. To this day, we don't really know if he was just trying to mess with us, trying to shoot us, or just drunk. But whatever the case may be, we were absolutely terrified when it all happened. So to the possibly drunk long-distance shooter, hopefully me and my family don't encounter you again. I remembered something that had happened to my best friend and I a few years ago, and I figured I would share it here. While my best friend and I were seniors in high school, we went on a weekend trip to visit my grandmother a couple hours away from my town in Georgia. The town that we lived in was comparatively small for the state, but one of the biggest towns within a few hours. But we had to travel about 2.5 hours through tiny, somewhat redneck towns to get to my grandmother's place. We were on our way back home when we had to stop at a gas station literally in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking cornfields, cotton fields, streets with no signs or lights, not even stop signs, and definitely no cell service. The convenience store that was attached to the gas station had maybe a couple snacks inside, but looked deserted from the outside, and we decided not to bother to get anything other than gas. I paid with card, mainly because I didn't want to leave my 5'1", 100-pound friend all alone in the car while I went alone inside. Another car had pulled up on the other side of the single gas pump while I just started pumping my gas, and because of everything I'd read before on Let's Not Meet, I already had a really weird feeling and decided to stay alert and stand outside of the car with my driver's side door wide open. The reason I did this was so that my friend could see and hear everything that was going on. A thin, late 50s-ish older man got out of the car and seemed to be paying at the pump and standing beside his car while I got gas. But after a few seconds, he walked around the pump and then maneuvered himself around my car door to stand within a foot of me and asked if he could pump my gas for me. Luckily, the gas nozzle was locked, so it was pumping without me having to hold it. I immediately placed myself between the opening of the door and the man, and I prepared to either shut the door with me inside it or move and slam it behind me to protect my friend if necessary. I calmly told him it was fine and no thank you. He looked me up and down with the corner of his lip tilted up and then said,
"You know, pretty girls like you shouldn't be out here all alone. And you definitely shouldn't have to do this by yourself. Let a man help you, baby."
And then proceeded to cover my hand with his own as he reached for the gas pump that I was holding. I jerked my hand out from underneath his and then slammed my car door shut. I then jerked my hand out from underneath his and slammed my car door shut, thinking the last thing that I would want is him jumping in my car and driving away with my friend in the passenger seat. Red flags were totally going off now. My typical overly polite demeanor turned serious as I remember something that I'd read here that said that it was better to be safe and to seem mean rather than be polite and uncomfortable. So I then responded and said, "Sir, get away from me. I can pump my own gas and I've already said no thank you. Leave us alone." He didn't move, only raised his chin and managed to make eye contact with me, his tilted lip totally gone now. I stared him down and I figured I'd gotten enough gas to last us enough time to get the crap out of wherever we were. So I made eye contact, pulled the nozzle out, and basically threw it back into the pump before getting in my car and driving away before he had even moved. As we drove away, I glanced in the rear view and saw that his car wasn't even being filled up with gas. So I'm guessing he was just driving by and then decided to help out a damsel in distress, even though I was nowhere even close to being a damsel in distress. My friend was shaking the whole way home, telling me she would have just let the man pump our gas. But I'm really glad of some of the confidence that I'd gained from this sub. It helped me stay attentive and respond confidently enough to get out of that crazy situation. So to the creepy, helpful gas station man in the middle of Ghost Town, Georgia, hopefully we won't meet ever again. This happened about 5 years ago now. I had just gotten through a really rough breakup of a codependent relationship, so I was going through a phase of trying to be more independent, self-sufficient, and just generally more okay with being alone. I would go to a lot of movies, restaurants, etc., all by myself. At the time, I was living in Montana where spending time outdoors is a prime recreation. Camping solo seemed like it would be a really good exercise in truly being self-reliant, so I packed a little tent and went to Jerry Johnson Hot Springs. Jerry Johnson is a natural hot springs with a few small, mostly natural pools in the mountains on the border of Montana and Idaho. I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible, so I won't go on explaining the place. What I will say, however, is that it's truly in the middle of nowhere. From the interstate, it's about a 1/3 mile hike across the bridge and into the woods. And from the interstate, it's about a 45-minute drive in either direction before you reach any kind of civilization in the form of a gas station. There isn't a motel or anything attached to the hot springs like there are with some. It's really just forest land with a few tiny ponds of warm water, and if you ever go, you'll probably be the only person there. There's plenty of daylight, so I decide I'll go soak first and then set up my camp when I'm finished. I make the short hike to find that there's a couple, A man and a woman around their 30s in the main pool, and they look kind of startled to see me. I say a friendly hello from a distance as I then approach. At first, they don't really respond, they just kind of stare at me. Then the guy pipes up. "What are you doing, man?" I then tell him that I'm really confused and I don't know what he means. The man then asks, "Are you the one that's been creeping around the woods and watching us for the last hour or so?" I assured them that I didn't know what they were talking about, and they began to tell me that there's someone in the woods way off of the trail. Apparently they'd been yelling at him and he just doesn't respond. He'll walk away into the woods for a while and then reappear somewhere else, just watching them. After they've been assured that it isn't me, I get undressed and get into the water. The pupils in their eyes were huge. I'm guessing that they ate some magic mushrooms. I never asked, but it seemed pretty obvious. It's not a big deal. It's basically the perfect setting for something like that, but it makes me think that they might just be having a bad trip. We talked for a while, and first about the creepy guy and then about some other stuff. The mood lightens and they seem pretty relieved not to be alone. I'm a relatively large guy and I guess there's strength in numbers. No more sightings of the creeper. They get out of the pool before me. I'm in the pool all by myself for about 10 minutes before I then hear some shouting in the woods. I decide to cut my soak short just in case someone's in trouble. I get out, dry off quickly, and then get dressed, still mostly wet, when I then hear another shout. I then start quickly hiking. I eventually come across the couple that was shouting off into the woods and saying things like, "Hey man, we have a gun," which they didn't. I ask what's going on and they say that the guy was just ominously standing in the path looking at them way off in the distance. When they started to shout at him, he left the path again and then retreated into the woods. Now he's out of sight. Through all of this happening, they never get a good look at him. We walk back to our cars. We decide that we're all going to camp near each other. There's an official campground, but you have to pay. The guy tells me that he knows about another spot that's relatively flat that would probably work for us. I agree and I decide to follow them. It's not very far. They set up their tent and I set up mine about 100 yards away. I wanted to give them plenty of space to trip or whatever, and I was out there in the first place to camp alone. We were in a dry season on raw forest floor, so neither of us made a campfire. I got all set up and just sat around reading a book, really enjoying all of the nature. The mosquitoes made me retreat into my tent at about 6 p.m., and by 9 I was sound asleep. At about midnight, I was then awoken by the sound of screaming. I grabbed my flashlight and my .22 pistol, put on my shoes but didn't tie them, and then started running toward the other tent. When I arrived, the two were standing outside of the tent with their own flashlights and completely losing it. They said that the guy had been there and that we all needed to get the crap out of there ASAP. They showed me a slice in the wall of their tent that he had made with a knife. They then haphazardly packed all of their stuff in a hurry and we went back to the cars. I only then realized that I hadn't actually grabbed any of my own stuff. I asked if they would go back with me to get it, and they basically just said, "Sorry dude, you're on your own," then got in their car and took off. I then thought about it for a minute. I could come back the next day and get my stuff, but it was over an hour drive in each direction, and I was there now. I did have a gun, but if I shot someone in the woods, even if self-defense, that would be the beginning of another nightmare that would probably last the rest of my life. I made the decision and decided to go back for my stuff. I killed my flashlight and basically went stealth ninja mode back into the trees surrounding the clearing where my tent was. My thought was that if I was really quiet then I could probably hear him, but he couldn't hear me. It took me about 20 minutes to get where my tent was since I was moving so slowly. When I got back to my tent, it was totally untouched. I quickly threw on my backpack, put my flashlight in my mouth, grabbed my tent in its fully assembled state with my sleeping bag still inside of it, and then ran back to the car with a loaded .22 revolver in my hand. I went back to my car, started it, and drove away. What didn't really occur to me until later is that I never actually saw this guy, and to this day, I can't really be sure that there was actually anyone in the woods at all. I really kind of doubt that these people would have sliced their own tent, but at the same time, I kind of doubt that there was actually just a dude hanging out in the wilderness all day and night just to freak these campers out. It's really possible that the two campers were really just messing around with me. If so, they really deserve Oscars for their performance, as they really seem genuinely terrified. I guess I'll never really know though. The story took place when I was 23 years old, so about 10 years ago. I was living in upstate New York in a very rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. He and I used to argue quite a lot. One morning before he went to work, he and I got into a very heated argument. He was 20 years my senior, but during this particular fight, he acted majorly juvenile. He jumped out of bed, flipped me the bird, and then yelled, "If you don't like it so much, then just go back to the Bronx." That was all the prompting I needed. I threw on my Uggs and my winter jacket, grabbed my cigarettes, and then flew out of the house. I'm unfortunately very impulsive, and I didn't think to grab my cell phone before I stormed out. I didn't drive, so my only option really was to walk. I don't think at the time that I intended to walk back to the Bronx, as it was a 3-hour car ride upstate, but I just really needed to go for an angry, dramatic walk. I realized that once I got to this road at the entrance of the trailer park that I had no idea where anything was around me, and I had only lived there for a few months at that point. And to be honest, we really didn't go out that often. I banked left and just walked and walked where I knew civilization was. I found myself walking alongside a very busy stretch of road, with 18-wheelers flying by and spraying me with slushy snow and totally soaking my shoes. I saw my then boyfriend driving by on his way to work, and he then sped up as he drove past me, evidently still angry about our fight. I thought for sure that he was going to turn around at some point, but he never came back. I pressed on, deciding instead to try to walk to my best friend's mother's house, which I knew to be in the same town. It started to snow and I was losing momentum. I passed a VFW where a nondescript pickup truck was then parked in the driveway. It wasn't until I had passed it that I had even realized the driver was in the front seat. He called out to me,
"Hey honey, do you need some help?"
My stomach churned, realizing I would have to accept this stranger's offer. I approached his truck very slowly and tried to weigh out my options. He was a clean-cut, seemingly normal older white guy. Gray hair, greenish blue eyes, just average. I blurted out, "Are you a good guy or a bad guy?" And I absolutely cringed at myself for asking such a dumb question. He answered,
"Well, I'm a good guy. I mean, I wouldn't really tell you if I was a bad guy though."
I ignored all of the bells that were going off in my head and got in the front seat with them. As we drove, I realized I had no clue where my friend's mom actually lived. I knew the name of the road she lived on, but it spanned a good distance, so it wasn't very helpful in terms of finding my destination. I asked to borrow a cell phone so that I could try calling my best friend to ask her where the heck I was going. I called her about 3 times and she didn't answer because I guess she didn't recognize the number. I started to feel inexplicably hopeless. After a few minutes, he asked me where I was from and why I was out in the middle of nowhere in the snow wearing pajamas. I then went on to explain that I was originally from the Bronx and that I had gotten into a fight with my boyfriend. He then paused and then he said,
So, you wouldn't be interested in making a little money, would you?"
I chuckled nervously and just said, no. Thanks though." He then responded,
"Well, I figured since you said you were from the Bronx,"
and then trailed off. Realizing at that point that I was almost definitely in deep crap, I muttered, "Oh, sure. He eyed me up and down and then laughed to himself before sneering.
Sure, she says."
I started to panic big time, but I knew that I couldn't show my fear. I scoured the scenery for a pillowy snowbank that I could probably land in if I leapt out of the truck to no avail. All of the houses were so few and far in between. I became certain that this would be how I met my demise. I'll never know why, but it was at this point that he decided to ask me who I was going to see. I quickly blurted out my best friend's mom's name and her husband's name. He instantly perked up and explained that he knew the husband. I felt the greatest wave of relief when he explained that he knew exactly where his old buddy lived. When we finally pulled up to that big yellow house, it was like arriving to the promised land. I sheepishly decided to ask his name.
Steve,
he said, and then he asked mine. I gave him a fake name, spat out a bullcrap thank you, and then ran as fast as I could from his truck to the porch. I crashed through the front door and then locked it behind me. I immediately started crying and running through the house, trying to find my friend's mom. I had actually awoken her from a really deep sleep, but she didn't say a word about it upon seeing how shaken up I was. Once I knew I was safe with her, I then went on to explain everything. The fight, the fleeing, and the weird guy and his sexual proposition, and she listened, horrified and curious at the same time. She made me promise to never do anything so reckless like that ever again, and if I needed her, to just call her. She told me that she would ask her husband when he got home about this Steve guy and find out more about him. I returned to my boyfriend's a little while later that same day, and I got really stoned, just trying to forget about all of the events that happened that morning. The following day, my friend's mom called me to tell me that Steve was a really dangerous person. Her husband had actually cut off communication with him years ago. The last he heard about Steve was that he had apparently got arrested for assault. She then went on to point out how incredibly easy it would have been for him to hurt me and leave me just about anywhere on some lonely stretch of road, and no one would even know where to look for me. Not to mention that I might not have even been found until the snow thawed out. It was a pretty terrifying experience. So I have an update. Upon sharing this post with the best friend of mine mentioned in this story, she reminded me that I left out a super unsettling detail. When her mom called, she was able to tell me Steve's last name. One of the first results on Google with his name plus the town's name brought me straight to a registered sex offender website with a mugshot of him. His eyes looked cold and empty, and I realized with him being on probation at the time, he would have been especially eager to not have me get him in any further trouble with the law. Her mom said it best when she told me that I must have had some serious guardian angels looking over me. So Steve, you disgusting creep, let's never encounter one another again.